There are certain cars in the collector car world that you just know are going to be incredibly valuable in 20, 30, 40 years. And then there are the cars that you just know are going to blow up in value in a year, maybe 2 years. And I strongly believe that the Porsche 944 is one of those cases. These cars are clinically undervalued right now, and I think in just a few years' time, they might become unobtainium. Here's why you should buy one this very instant, like yesterday. Now, if you have not been living under the rock for the last 4 or 5 years, you know that air-cooled 911s from the 70s, the 80s, and 90s have just shot up in value. And even finding the cheapest of the drivers, you're gonna spend like 35, 40 grand plus. More like 45, 50 for a half decent one. Now, when you compare that to the 944, the front-engined water-cooled Porsche, a good one of these, 7 to 10 grand for a basic model, maybe 15 or 20 for a turbo like this car. So they're half the price of a 911, and they're just not half as good. In a lot of ways, they're even better than a Porsche 911. Now, the first thing you notice when you get behind the wheel of a Porsche 944 is just how small they feel. Total length is about the same as a brand new Subaru BRZ, but they feel so much lower, so much more intimate when you're sitting next to somebody. And the second thing you notice is they are incredibly quiet from the factory. So this car has a stock exhaust. And I would say the vast majority of them, now that they're older and, you know, get in the hands of tuners, probably have aftermarket exhausts on them. But from the factory, that was 4,000 RPM and you can hear none of it. They are so incredibly silent. It really is almost alarming. You think of these cars, especially the turbos, as being, you know, screamy and shouty with blow-offs and pew, and there's just none of it. So every Porsche 944 had a 4-cylinder engine, and the displacement changes depending on the year. Some have a 2.5 liter, some have a 2.7, and then the later cars, they had like a 3-liter 4-cylinder, but they were all 4 cylinders. Now this was, well, it started life out as half of a 928 V8, and then Porsche went ahead and changed pretty much everything, but this engine was pretty sophisticated for the time. Now this model is a 1987, and in 1987 there were 3 variants of this car: the 944, the 944S, and the 944 Turbo, which is what this car is. So the base 944 had about 147 horsepower, the 944S had 188, that was a 16-valve engine, and then the Turbo, 217 horsepower, 8 valves, low compression because it was the 1980s, but it's turbocharged, so 243 pound-feet of torque. Now the cool thing is, the owner's manual not only shows you the horsepower and the torque, but one thing I love, and you gotta appreciate about Porsche, is if you go a little further back, they actually go through the acceleration curves, the full power curves of all the different models. And you can see, for example, like the Turbo, you can actually track the horsepower and the torque depending on the output. And you can see that max horsepower doesn't occur till nearly 6,500 RPM. And then you also have the different gearing. So these were actually pretty high performance cars back in the day. When you consider the 1980s was a terrible time for vehicles and horsepower, the 944 Turbo in 87 was rated to go from 0 to 60 in 6.1 seconds and reach a maximum speed of over 150 miles an hour. So these things are really good performers. Now, one of the most interesting things about the 944 Turbo is when you get on it, it really moves. Like really moves. I've driven a lot of cars from the 1980s and even cars that are supposed to be quick and high performance cars like that 911 we just bought, and they don't feel quick by modern day standards. This car does. It just picks up its skirt and pulls, and it just seems to never stop pulling. It really is a quick car, even by modern day standards. Now, I'm sure if you line this up against something like a Golf GTI, it probably wouldn't hold much of a candle to it, but for a car that's going on 34 years old, it's just a little rocket ship compared to most that I've driven. The Porsche lineup for 1987 was actually pretty big and extensive. So at the base end of the spectrum, you had the 924, stepping up a step was the 944 and all its variants. Then you had the 911, and the most expensive vehicle in the lineup, of course, was the 928, the V8 front-engined water-cooled Grand Tourer. Now the cool thing about the Turbo for 1987, 217 horsepower, which interestingly enough is the exact same horsepower output as a 911 from the same year, at least a basic 911, 217. These cars weigh under 3,000 pounds, albeit 2 pounds, under 3,000 pounds. Now there are a few ways to differentiate the turbos from the standard 944s, and just as a kind of a quick sidebar, the turbos had the internal designation 951. So if you read that, it means that you're looking at a 944 turbo. But take a look at like the lower front end. So this had a much more aggressive front end splitter, a little bit lower, had different fog lights up front here, a little bit more streamlined than other 944s. So if we come along to the side, these wheels are very iconic 1980s. These are original to the car. They are called phone dials. They look really cool. You'll notice a little Porsche script there on the brake calipers. The turbos had the brakes off of the 911, by the way. And then some other differences. At the back of the vehicle, you notice turbo written across the passenger rear side, and it had this really kind of unique rear splitter in the back. Those are a few ways to tell a turbo from a standard 944. So here we see the key of the Porsche 944 for 1987, same key as the 911, and they have this iconic feature, by the way, where if you push in on this button, it engages this little light. Got to replace the battery in this guy. But here is how you unlock the door in a 944. Stick it in the slot, turn it, doors unlock. This second slot, by the way, is for the factory alarm system. Now the door handles themselves are very cool. You just have this little tiny lever within the actual handle. Pull the lever and that pops open the door, and listen to the door thunk. Oh, you thought 1980s Mercedes door sounded good? That is not far off. One interesting thing about this Porsche is that the key slot is not on the left side of the steering wheel as Porsche is iconic for. Instead, you have the headlight switch. The key slot is actually in the normal place on the right side of the steering wheel. However, the handbrake, the parking brake, is on the left side of, well, the seat or the steering wheel. Pull up, push the button down, and that's where the parking brake is on a 944. Okay, so one of the most iconic aspects of any 944, the pop-up headlights. These are such a cool feature on this car, and here's how they work. It's a surprisingly simple mechanism, although one that is fairly failure prone. So here is the motor for the headlights, and you can see it just spins basically this little bell crank that acts on the rod, and that causes the headlights to pop up and down. And then of course, if the motor fails, as ours did last week, you also have this little rotary knob, and you can manually twist them up and down, although it takes an eternity. But Porsche did come up with a manual override in case they stop going up and down as they should. So in this Porsche, you've got what look to be fairly standard air vents. You've got up, down, left, and right, and then you can use this to actually change the flow to close the main vents and direct air toward the defrost setting, which is pretty cool. But what is this little tiny vent? Why does it have this adjustment? This is actually a button, and this button resets the trip computer. That's right, so this resets the little trip odometer there by the speedometer. Push in, go to 0, or 9, there we go, 0. Very simple climate controls in a 944. So you've got one knob here for fan speed. You've got another knob here for temperature. You'll notice the numbers go from 18 to 30, and that's because this was a Canadian market car, and this is Celsius. And then you can kind of control the airflow using these little guys, and then a button over here for air conditioning. So here we've got a very basic digital clock, or at least it looks basic until you start fiddling with the buttons. See, if you push this right button, the numbers go to 0, and that's because this is actually, come on, there it goes, a stopwatch. So it's not only a standard clock, it's also a stopwatch. You can start, you can reset it, and then of course return it back to a normal clock when you get off the racetrack. Down here we have a line of kind of haphazard switches which don't have much of a rhyme or reason. This is actually your sunroof control, so you can push in and lift the sunroof. So that's how you lift the rear portion of the sunroof. Here we have the rear wiper. Over here is the mirror control to select the left or the right mirror adjustment, and then the lock switch. But the funny thing is, even though the mirror control is down here by the shifter, the actual little knob to do that is over here by the window switches. So it's a two-hand operation to move the mirrors on a 944. This is a control, and then you use this switch down here to change which mirror you're adjusting. One other word about the sunroof. So you can unclip the front portion of the sunroof, raise the rear, and then remove the whole panel. So it's kind of like a T-top, except just the sunroof portion. Of course, you can just lift and lower the rear at the push of a button, but you can also remove the whole thing by undoing a couple of latches. The transmission feel in this car is one of the best I've ever experienced. It almost feels weighted. It's like the gear stick is urging you up a gear. It's got this little kind of click to it as you change gears. It feels genuinely incredible, and that's pretty amazing because this car has a rear-mounted transaxle, which means that the transmission is in the back. So there's a lot of linkages connecting this stick to the actual transmission, and that gives this car nearly 50-50 perfect weight distribution. The 944 in particular, the 1980s model, I think is one of the best looking Porsches of all time. In fact, one of the best looking cars of all time. And that is one of the big reasons I think that this car is just highly undervalued. For a long time there, these cars were like $3-4 grand, and you'd see them in high school parking lots with stupid aftermarket exhaust and mismatched color body panels, and they were just kind of ugly. But now that they're hitting, 35 years old, you start seeing fewer and fewer of them. When you do see one, you can really appreciate just how beautiful the proportions are. It's got an incredibly long hood, a really swept back windshield leading into this fastback design with this coupe-like profile, and then it's brought to a taper in the back by this little plastic spoiler, and then straight vertical in the rear. It is one of, I think, the best looking cars of all time, just from a proportion standpoint. And you've got the wide arched fenders on the side, just a gorgeous car. One of the best parts about these old Porsches are the steering wheels, very no nonsense, super thin by modern day standards, but they just feel incredible to hold. They've got ribbing along the back, and then the middle section, well, it is a horn button. Now, I've read that I think the vast majority of 944 turbos sold here in the US in '87 had an airbag. This is a Canadian market car, so no airbag. And the airbag steering wheel is really ugly, so I like this old school steering wheel. And I also love the gauge. It's very simple, no nonsense. Temperature, fuel, speed in kilometers an hour, tach, turbo gauge, and then you had the oil pressure and the battery voltage. Now, this car does have a rear seat, and it is foldable, so right now it's in its down position, and then it latches in place up top here. I will try getting into it for scientific purposes, but I have a feeling this was more for insurance reasons than, oh wow. That is gotta be, that's gotta be one of the worst rear seats in the history of the automobile. I mean, that's literally beyond useless. I don't even know if a kid could sit back here. That's just incredibly bad. All right, we are going to fold those rear seats down and never use them ever again. So one thing I love about this Porsche, and I'm not sure why no other modern manufacturer does this, is the integration of the rear hatch. So it's just the glass that lifts up, but technically this car is a hatch. So many modern coupes like the BRZ, the FRS, that kind of thing, they have trunks, but the 944 has this enormous hatchback with this giant glass basically canopy, and then when you lift it up, you have access to the entire rear storage area, which is just enormous. And lastly, we come to the handling. This car is some of the best steering I've ever experienced. You feel every pebble, every little imperfection in the road through the steering wheel. It has power steering, so unlike the 911, it does, have power assistance, but it's just perfectly weighted, and the chassis dynamics, the way the car transitions from corner to corner is incredible. There is no way that this car is not going to be a $50,000 car in a few years. I just don't believe it. You can't have a car that drives this nicely, that has this wide of a power band, that looks this good, and have it be 15 grand forever. It's just, I don't think it's possible. Now, I truly do believe that dollar for dollar, these cars, like this was an $18,000 vehicle with 100,000 miles. It was half the price as our 911 that we just bought, and the 911 was pretty clapped out in comparison. They're not half the car, in fact, and I think in a lot of ways, they're better than an equivalent air-cooled 911 from the same era. They drive better. They're just as quick if you don't get like a 911 turbo. I think they handle better with that perfect 50-50 weight distribution, and they look amazing. And eventually people are going to figure that out, and these cars are going to be $25,000, $30,000, $35,000. Right now, you can pick up a turbo like this for under $20K in good condition, and please do, because they're so much fun, and I do think that they will be a very collectible item one day. Plus, they look amazing, and you can drive the wheels off of them. They're pretty reliable, a little bit cheaper to keep on the road, I think, than the 911, and just an all-around banger of a car. Well, let me know what you think in the comment section below. As always, this has been Tommy with TFL Classics. Check out tflcar.com for the latest and greatest in new car reviews.